Hello again, Year 9. It's Mrs. Maloney here. I'm going to be taking you through the last of this week's Romeo and Juliet lessons. You're going to need your student booklet, you're going to need a piece of paper, and you're going to need a pen. So, a brief recap from last lesson. We learn that Juliet, when she wakes up in the tomb, is next to Romeo's body and she uses his dagger to kill herself. She kisses him because, if you recall, she's hopeful that there's enough of that powerful poison to help her on her way. But when she realises there isn't and she hears the noise, she grabs his dagger and she stabs herself. We learnt that Romeo and Juliet's final meeting mirrors their first. We had all that talk of lips and hands and kissing, and we can see, we did a bit of comparison, didn't we, about the differences and similarities between their first meeting and their final meeting. And we also talked about how Juliet had changed throughout the play, how she'd started off as being quite a quiet and submissive and obedient person to, by the end, being really determined and quite feisty and pushing for what she wanted. So that was last lesson. Okay, in this lesson we're going to learn that Prince Aeschylus brings the feuding families together at the end of the play. We're going to see that the Montagues and the Capulets agree to a truce, an agreement to settle their issues with each other. However, the relief of this truce is soured by the tragedy of the deaths of the children. Romeo and Juliet follows the conventions of tragedy as defined by A.C. Bradley, and Romeo and Juliet are typical tragic heroes. So, a convention is a kind of rule, if you like. When we look at conventions in literary texts, we're saying these are the sorts of steps that it follows to make it a tragedy. So you're going to need both of those essays that we've already read by A.C. Bradley. Okay, so make sure that you've got your student booklet handy, and then we'll get cracking on the rest of the lesson. So we're going to start off by thinking today about who you think is the most responsible for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. And we've got lots of different options here, haven't we? We've got Romeo and Juliet themselves, okay? What reasons might there be that they are responsible for this? They got married very, very quickly. They did it in secret. They didn't tell anybody what they were doing. Juliet defied her family. Those might be reasons you want to consider. Is it Lord Capulet, perhaps with his determination that Juliet was going to marry who he wanted and telling her what to do? Was it Lady Capulet not standing up for Juliet against her father and saying, "I would the fool were married to her grave"? That might be a reason. Is it Friar Lawrence? Friar Lawrence was, as we know, instrumental in helping to organise the marriage. He agreed to marry them in secret, and although his motives were good, the outcome was, as we know, utterly tragic. Was it Paris, perhaps? So have a think about which characters you think might be the most responsible for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. As an extension task, we can ask ourselves this question: in the end, does it matter who is responsible? And if so, why? If not, why not? So have a think about those questions. Pause the recording now and just jot down some notes in response to the question, and think about what responsibility each character might bear. Okay, so brief recap of what we read and saw last lesson. On discovering Romeo's dead body, Juliet took his dagger and killed herself, and these are her final words in the play. She says, "O happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rust and let me die." And we can see we've got some stage directions here that she falls on Romeo's body and dies. And if you recall, we talked about the fact that she calls it a happy dagger because she sees it as an opportunity to be reunited with her husband, with her one true love. Okay. However, the play does not end with Romeo and Juliet killing themselves. Okay, their bodies are discovered. Prince Aeschylus, who we know from the beginning, he was the one at the beginning of the play who said, you know, if you disrupt the peace again, your lives will pay the forfeit of the peace. And he's the one who banishes Romeo to Mantua on the discovering that he's responsible for Tybalt's death. Prince Aeschylus summons Lord and Lady Capulet, Juliet's parents, and Lord Montague, Romeo's father. Okay, and that's how the play finishes, with these families being brought together by the prince. So once the bodies of Romeo and Juliet are discovered, Friar Lawrence tells everybody what's happened. And it's really important that we understand that Friar Lawrence is able to do this because he's the only person who really knows everything, isn't he? He's the person who's been in on it from the very beginning. He's agreed to marry them. He knows about the plan to get the letter to Romeo in Mantua. He knows about the plan because obviously he helped Juliet to plan faking her death. So he's able to explain the whole situation. And at the end of the play, Prince Aeschylus brings Lord and Lady Capulet and Lord Montague together. And what we're going to do now is we're going to read the final part of Act 5, Scene 3 to the very end of the play. These are going to be on the next slides, and as always, I've put the original Shakespeare next to the modern translation to help us understand exactly what's being said. Okay, so the prince, he confronts Lords Montague and Capulet with the consequences of their feud, and they agree to a truce and agree to make statues of each other's children. So we're going to read from here. Okay, so the prince reads a letter and he says, "This letter doth make good the friar's words, their course of love, the tidings of her death." And here he writes that he did buy a poison of a poor apothecary, and therewithal came to this vault to die and lie with Juliet. Where be these enemies? Capulet, Montague, see what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love, and I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished. And Capulet replies, "O brother Montague, give me thy hand. This is my daughter's jointure, for no more can I demand." Montague replies, "But I can give thee more, for I will raise her statue in pure gold, that whiles Verona by that name is known, there shall no figure at such rate be set as that of true and faithful Juliet." And Capulet says, "As rich shall Romeo's by his ladies lie, poor sacrifices of our enmity." And essentially, the prince is saying, okay, the letter confirms everything that the friar has said. But he also confronts Capulet and Montague and says, "Do you see what's happened as a result of your hating? Heaven has figured out a way to kill the joy with love, to kill your joys with love." And he also says that he's lost members of his family as a result of the feud. And then we can see that Capulet and Montague agree to a truce. And Montague says that he'll raise a statue of Juliet in pure gold, and Capulet agrees to do the same of Romeo. And they agree, or Capulet says, they were sacrifices, poor sacrifices, due to this rivalry that's been ongoing between the Montagues and the Capulets. Okay, so the prince has the final lines of the play, and he explains that even though there's a truce, it will take a really long time for the families to recover from these tragic events. And so the final lines of the play are as follows. "A glooming peace this morning with it brings, the sun for sorrow will not show his head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things, for some shall be pardoned and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." And at the end, every character exits the stage. And we can see that what this means is that although there is a truce, it's a very dark and uneasy piece. It's not calm and relaxed. And he uses this metaphor of saying that the sun won't show his head, this idea that even the sun doesn't want to shine just yet because it's still too sad. And he says that some people will be forgiven, but some will be punished, but that actually there's never been a story that is more upsetting and full of sadness and pain than this story of Romeo and Juliet. Okay. Now we've read the final part of the play, I want you to just jot down in note form, this is just for you, don't need to hand them in, what are your answers to these questions. What happens to the feud at the end of the play? Why does that happen? And what is the weather used as a metaphor in lines 321 to 322? So you'll need to go back and look at the extracts we've just seen in order to do this. Pause the recording now and just write down your ideas in response to these questions. Okay, so hopefully you got some of these ideas written down as your answers. Lord Capulet and Montague put the feud to one side and they agreed to make peace. Okay, the deaths of their children have made the leaders of the two families realise that the feud was pointless. It's led to the needless deaths of their beloved children. And he says, doesn't he, they've kind of paid the price of their enmity, their animosity towards each other. Prince Aeschylus is glad that the two families have made peace, but is devastated that it was only achieved through the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. He compares his gladness to the sun, which can't be seen from behind grey clouds. So, as we said before, even though there's this peace, it's not yet strong enough to be seen. There's still too much sadness about these unnecessary deaths of Romeo and Juliet at this point. If you got these answers, that's brilliant. If you didn't, make a note of them and just add any ideas that you missed to your notes. Right then, so the final lines of the play are, "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." We already know that Romeo and Juliet is one of Shakespeare's most famous and loved tragedies. And as we've gone through this unit of work, you've read 2 lectures written by A.C. Bradley. They are in your student booklet, okay, which talk about the plot and characters and what makes a tragedy. You're going to spend some time now reviewing those lectures, going back, rereading them and making some notes around them based on what you now know about the story Romeo and Juliet. So make sure you've got those to hand, make sure you've got your student booklet ready, and make sure you've got a pen. If you've got a highlighter, that's brilliant as well. Okay, so you need to look in your student book and you need to reread the 2 A.C. Bradley lectures on tragedy. As you read, you're going to annotate the lectures with notes on how they apply to the characters of Romeo and Juliet and to the play Romeo and Juliet as a whole. We're going to do the start of lecture number 1 together, so make sure that you've got that handy, okay, and we'll show you exactly what it is you need to do. Okay, so this is an example of the sort of thing that we're looking for you to do. Okay, in A.C. Bradley's first lecture, which is all about the things that make up a Shakespearean tragedy, we can see an example of how to annotate. Okay, so in the opening of this lecture, it says, first, it's the story of one person, the hero, or at most of 2, the hero and heroine. It is only in the love tragedies Romeo and Juliet and Antony and Cleopatra that the heroine is as much at the centre of the action as the hero. The rest, including Macbeth, are single stars. We may speak of the tragic story as being concerned primarily with one person. And what you can see is that this person, this example here, has been annotated to show how Bradley's ideas link to the story of Romeo and Juliet. So if we look at the second line, okay, where it says most of two people, we know that Romeo and Juliet focuses on Romeo and Juliet. We know that Romeo is the hero and Juliet is the heroine. If we look a bit further down, and it says that in Romeo and Juliet, the heroine is as much at the centre of the action as the hero. And we can see that this person has identified that Juliet in the play is just as important as Romeo. And then when we get to the end of this paragraph, we can see that where it says we may speak of the tragic story as being concerned primarily with one person, in Romeo and Juliet, that doesn't apply. There are two characters. So your task is to go through these two lectures. Okay, you've got them in your student booklets, but I've also popped them on the next two slides for you, just in case. Okay, and annotate them, finding information and seeing where Romeo and Juliet slots in to A.C. Bradley's ideas. Right then, so here's lecture 1 from A.C. Bradley, called The Substance of Shakespearean Tragedy. Now, you looked at this way back in lesson 5 and you've got it in your student booklet, but I'm going to read it to you so that you can go through and you can stop and you can re-record and you can listen again if that's going to help you in order to annotate it. Okay, so I'm not going to read the bit in the blurb, I'm just going to read from where it starts in the main body of the lecture for you. Okay. In this lecture, we will consider this question: what makes a Shakespearean tragedy? To address this task, we will take examples from across his plays and we will gradually arrive at an overall idea of what is meant by the term Shakespearean tragedy. One character. First, a Shakespearean tragedy is the story of one person, the hero, or at most of two, the hero and heroine. It is only in Romeo and Juliet and Antony and Cleopatra that the heroine is as much the centre of the action as the hero. The other tragedies, including Macbeth, has single stars. We may speak of the tragic story as being usually concerned with one person. So that's the paragraph that we've already looked at and seen how it's annotated, okay? Death. The story next leads up to and includes the death of the hero. No play that ends up with the hero remaining alive can be called a tragedy. The play ends with the hero's death. The rest of the story depicts the troubled part of the hero's life which leads up to his death. A Shakespearean tragedy is a tale of suffering and calamity concluding in death. Okay, we can see we've got a definition there of depicts and calamity. So depicts means to show, calamity is a terrible accident. Status. Shakespeare is concerned always with persons of high status in his tragedies. They are often kings or princes, at the least as in Romeo and Juliet, with members of great houses whose quarrels impact a large number of people. Action. The calamities of tragedy do not simply happen, nor are they sent by some god. They occur from characters' actions. We see people placed in certain circumstances and we see certain actions. These actions lead on to others and so on until this series of actions leads to a catastrophe, an awful disaster. The effect is to make us view the sufferings of the catastrophe as something which is caused by the hero. The hero always contributes in some way to the disaster in which he or she perishes. So essentially, he's saying that the hero's actions actually contribute to their death. The tragic world is a world of action. We see men and women strike into the existing order of things in pursuit of their ideas. But what they achieve is not what they wanted. It is terribly unlike it. They act freely, and yet their action traps them hand and foot. They lead themselves into a snare, a trap of their own creation. Everywhere in Shakespeare's tragedies, the hero desires something and he tries to obtain it, but whatever he dreams of, he achieves that which he least dreamed of, his own destruction. So that, by way of summary, we may define tragedy thus. A tragedy is a story of human actions producing exceptional calamity and ending in the death of such a man. Character. Let us turn now from the action to the central figure in it, and let us ask whether they have any characteristics in common which are essential to Shakespearean tragedies. One they certainly have. They are exceptional beings. We have seen already that the hero is a person of high status or of public importance, and that his actions or sufferings are of an unusual kind. But this is not all. His nature also is exceptional and generally raises him in some respect much above the average level of humanity. In almost all tragic heroes we observe a marked one-sidedness, a deadly tendency to pursue one interest, object or passion. This is, for Shakespeare, the fundamental tragic characteristic. It is present in his early heroes, Romeo and Richard II. Both are infatuated, one with love, one with power. This infatuation is what makes them exceptional, and in both cases it is what leads to their catastrophic deaths. So what you need to do is you now need to go back and you need to listen to this again if you wish, but you need to annotate your lecture with examples of where Romeo and Juliet fits in with these ideas. Okay, so we can see in the second paragraph, for example, that the story leads up to and includes the death of the hero. Well, we know that Romeo and Juliet both die, so straight away we can see that this fits Bradley's definition of what makes a Shakespearean tragedy. Okay, take your time with this, and when you're ready and you've annotated and found as many ideas as you can to link to Romeo and Juliet, you need to move on to the next slide where I'll read the second lecture to you and you will do exactly the same thing, okay? All right then, so in lecture 2, which we again looked at all the way back in lesson 9 during this unit of work, Bradley talks about the construction of Shakespeare's tragedy, so the different parts that make up a play. Again, I'm going to read this, and as you listen, you can annotate and circle or underline or highlight and annotate the different aspects that relate to Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read the blurb, I'm just going to start from the main body of the essay. You have this in your student booklet, okay? Having discussed the substance of a Shakespearean tragedy, we should naturally go on to examine the form. So if you remember, the form is the structure. I intend to speak of the construction of his plots. As a Shakespearean tragedy represents a conflict which terminates in a catastrophe, any such tragedy may roughly be divided into 3 parts. The first of these sets forth the situation out of which the conflict arises. It may therefore be called the exposition. So the exposition is the introduction. It's where we learn the key situation and where the conflict comes from. The second deals with the definite beginning, the growth of the various conflicts. It forms the bulk of the play, comprising the second, third and fourth acts, and usually a part of the first and part of the fifth. This middle section we may call the rising tensions. Okay, so in Romeo and Juliet, this is where we see all of the different events that lead up to the catastrophe, the deaths of the main characters. The final section of the tragedy shows the issue of the conflict in a catastrophe, and we already know a catastrophe is an awful disaster. The application of this scheme of division is naturally more or less arbitrary, so it kind of can seem a little bit random. The first part glides into the second and the second into the third, and there may often be difficulty in drawing the lines between them. So what he's saying is it's not always that easy to identify where the exposition ends and the rising tension begins, and where the rising tension ends and the catastrophe begins. Okay. So, exposition. The main business of the exposition is to introduce us into a little world of persons, to show us their positions in life, their circumstances, their relations to one another, and perhaps something of their characters, and to leave us keenly interested in the question, what will come out of this condition of things? In short, Shakespeare establishes the status quo of the world of the play. We are left expectant because their situation in regard to one another points to difficulties in the future. This situation is not one of conflict, but it threatens conflict. For example, we see first the hatred of the Montagues and Capulets, and then we see Romeo ready to fall violently in love, and then we hear talk of a marriage between Juliet and Paris, but the exposition is not complete, and the conflict has not definitely begun to arise, till in the last scene of the first act, Romeo the Montague sees Juliet the Capulet and becomes her slave. The end of the exposition is generally marked in the mind of the reader by a feeling that the action it contains is for the moment complete, but has left a problem. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the lovers have met, but their families are embroiled in a deadly feud. And so we ask, what will come of this? So this essay is quite helpful, really, because there's quite a lot of information in here that can help you draw links to Romeo and Juliet, particularly in relation to the exposition. Okay, rising tension. Obstacles. We come now to rising tension, which constitutes the bulk of the play. In some tragedies, the tension can be identified with opposing persons or groups. So it is in Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth. But it is not always so. Indeed, the battle between the two families is not the only obstacle the heroes must overcome in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet must also act in defiance of her father's promise of marriage to his friend Paris. During the rising of tension, the hero must overcome the obstacles that lay in his way. These obstacles have been established in the exposition. So the obstacles, the things that are getting in the way of the hero and heroine in this case, have already been presented to us in the opening. Then we have a crisis. In all the tragedies, there is a critical point in the action which proves also to be a turning point, which we may call the crisis. The crisis, as a rule, comes somewhere near the middle of the play. In the tragic plays, the crisis tends to be the point at which the hero obtains exactly what he's been striving towards. In Macbeth, this may be the successful assassination of Duncan and Macbeth's ascension to the throne. The fortunes of Romeo and Juliet rise and culminate in their marriage. After this moment, the hero's fortunes begin to decline, which ultimately concludes in a catastrophe. And then finally, on to the catastrophe. We've already touched on the nature of catastrophe, the final part of a Shakespearean tragedy. It is worth mentioning, however, that Shakespeare very rarely makes the least attempt to surprise by his catastrophes. They are felt to be inevitable, unavoidable, though the precise way in which they will be brought about is not, of course, foreseen. Occasionally, where we dread the catastrophe because we love the hero, a moment occurs just before it in which a gleam of false hope lights up the darkening scene, and though we know it's false, it affects us. But no play at the end of which the hero remains alive is a tragedy. The story depicts the troubled part of the hero's life which precedes and leads up to his death. It is, in fact, essentially a tale of suffering and calamity concluding in death. Okay, so as with the first lecture, your task is to, you can go back and listen to this again, but you need to annotate or highlight or underline any aspects of this lecture that you can link to the play and the plot of Romeo and Juliet. So pause your recording now and take some time to do that, please. All right, so you've got the two lectures and hopefully you can either listen to me reading them or you've reread them and you're annotating the lectures with notes on how they apply to the characters of Romeo and Juliet and to the play Romeo and Juliet as a whole. Take 10 minutes to annotate lecture 1 and 10 minutes to annotate lecture 2. Don't spend too long doing it, all right? Okay. Okay, grab yourselves a piece of paper and create a chart on there. Okay, this is just for your notes, so don't worry too much about, keeping it super neat. It just needs to be something that you can work from, all right? You're going to create a chart. It needs 2 columns, and we're going to be thinking about which character is more tragic, Romeo or Juliet. You're going to, in the first column, column A, you're going to put down all of your ideas in favour of the idea that Romeo is the most tragic character. In column B, you're going to put down all of your ideas in favour that Juliet is the most tragic character. So pause the recording now and thinking about what you've learned so far, jot down as many ideas in each column as you possibly can. Okay, here are some ideas to help you. So you can now go back to your columns and you can add any ideas that you perhaps missed or you hadn't considered. So in column A, Romeo is more tragic because his love for Juliet is intense. His love is more passionate. He also goes against the wishes of his family and he betrays his family by marrying Juliet. Romeo kills in the name of love. He commits a great sin when he kills Tybalt. He's selfless. He leaves the city in the hope that he can save Juliet and see her again in the future. And then finally, he loves Juliet so much that he kills himself when he thinks she's dead because he cannot imagine living without her. In column B, Juliet is more tragic because she's so young. She's only 13, which makes her death truly awful. Juliet has the most to lose by betraying her father's wishes. Refusing her father's orders is radical and shocking because she's a girl. Romeo is going against his family, but his punishment for that would have been far less because he's a boy. Okay, moving on. Juliet becomes more and more isolated as the play continues. She loses her family and all of her friends because of her love for Romeo. Juliet suffers the most. Her cousin is murdered by her husband. She defies her father and she has to pretend to kill herself with poison. She has to put herself through a huge amount, doesn't she? And then finally, she loves Romeo so much that she kills herself when she thinks he is dead. She cannot imagine living without him. And if we look at the last boxes in both columns, they are the same. They both feel that they love each other so deeply and so intensely that they cannot live without each other. So make sure that you've added any notes to your chart that you've created, okay, so that you've got as much detail as possible. Pause the recording now and make sure you've got those things written down, please. Overall, what is your opinion? Which character is more tragic, Romeo or Juliet? I'd like you to write a paragraph using now the ideas that you've come up with and some of the ideas on the previous PowerPoint slide to help you, okay? And maybe spend about 5 or 10 minutes just putting this into a paragraph. Which character, in your opinion, is more tragic, Romeo or Juliet? Make sure that you include a reason for that. Make sure you justify your ideas by explaining why you think that's really important. Okay, so pause the recording now and get your paragraph written for me. Okay, so to finish today's lesson, we're going to finish with our mastery statements. So we've got 5 statements here. Which events from Romeo and Juliet show that it's a tragedy? A. Romeo and Juliet are from powerful families with high status in Verona. B. The play was written in the Elizabethan era by William Shakespeare. C. Both of the main characters die in terrible ways at the end of the play. D. The Montagues and Capulets are 2 feuding families. E. Romeo and Juliet's love for each other is intense and passionate. Their love is greater than many other love stories. Okay, write down the statements that you feel show that Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. Do that now. Pause the recording. Okay, so hopefully you identified that statements A, C and E were events in Romeo and Juliet which show that it's a tragedy. We know that Romeo and Juliet are from powerful families with high status, and that's what Bradley says in his essay, isn't it? We know that they both die in terrible ways at the end of the play, and we know that for it to be a tragedy, the main characters have to die. And we know that their love for each other is intense and passionate. and that pushes the drama on. Okay, so this is your last formal Romeo and Juliet lesson for this week. You've done fantastically well keeping up with all of the lessons year 9, and we're very much looking forward to hopefully seeing you very soon. Okay, take care. Thank you. Bye.